بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. I'm very happy to be here and I'm very honored by this wonderful turnout. And the translation's okay? Keep speaking. Und Sie können alle Englisch verstehen, nicht wahr? Das ist, mein Deutsch ist sehr schwach. Ich kann auf Deutsch nicht gut sprechen, aber Englisch für mich ist viel leichter. So today what we want to talk about is Islam and the cultural imperative. That's an article that I wrote that if you like you could read on the internet. It's now been translated into German. Culture is an extremely important part of Islamic law. And in Islamic law, of course, we have overriding principles, we have objectives of the law, we call those in Arabic maqasid, overriding principles. The basic overriding principles of the law are the protection of life, the protection of intellect, the protection of sound religiosity, the protection of the family, of the economy, and of honor, of human dignity and honor. So these are the overriding principles. Then in the law we have what are called in English maxims. We call them qawa'id kulliyah, qawa'id kulliyah. And there are many, many maxims, but 5 of the maxims, which are called al-kulliyat al-khams, al-kulliyah, these are matters of consensus among all Islamic jurists. And they would contend that these 5 maxims are the very foundation of the law, that the whole law, the whole prophetic law is based on these 5 maxims. And these maxims are al-umuru bi-maqasidiha, al-umuru bi-maqasidiha, that matters are to be judged by their purposes. Matters are to be judged by their purposes. In other words, we don't do things merely as formalities. There are specific purposes that are to be attained, and we have to keep an eye on the purposes. And we have another one which says, al-yaqinu la yazulu bi-shak, that certainty is not removed by doubt. So this pertains to proof, and this pertains also to intellect and to other things. That when I know, for example, another person well, and I know what kind of a person they are, if I should hear a rumor, a bad rumor about them, it is illogical for me to believe the rumor and not to believe what I know. That's just one example. Al-yaqinu la yazulu bi-shak. Certainty is not removed by doubt. Certainty must be changed by certainty. And then we have another maxim, ad-dararu yuzal. Ad-dararu yuzal. That harm must be removed. So we are not supposed to endure harmful situations. And again, these are broad principles, so they apply to many things. But, for example, if there were abuse in a family, then that has to be removed. It has to be taken care of. And you could not tell people, no, just be patient. No, you don't be patient with harm. Harm has to be removed. And then we have another principle, which is al-mashaqqatu tajlibu at-taysir. Al-mashaqqatu tajlibu at-taysir. That difficulty, which is not the same as harm, difficulty will bring facilitation, meaning that that we don't want in our lives as Muslims unnecessary difficulty. And we don't want difficulty for the sake of difficulty. So these are 4 of these principles, and we could talk about them all day. We could talk about them all year. They're very, very important. But then there is a 5th maxim, and this is the one that I want to illustrate today. And this is al-'ada muhakkama. Al-'adatu muhakkama. That good cultural convention has the power of law. It has the power of the sunnah of the Prophet. And therefore, wherever Muslims went in history, and this was typical of us for the first 1,000 years. Today, if we look at Muslims in many situations, the Muslim Ummah today is extremely confused, is extremely divided. There's a lot of ignorance. We don't know our tradition. We don't know our past. But today you would never think that. You would think that Islam is even culturally predatory, that it has nothing to do with the cultures of the people that it lives with, but that's against the law. Islamic law requires you to understand the people around you and to evaluate the way they live, the way they behave, to learn the languages that they use, and to take the best from that and to build on it. This is what that means. Al-'adatu muhakkama. Again, no Islamic jurist, male or female, by the way, because scholarship in Islam is both male and female. It is a societal obligation in Islamic law for women to excel in knowledge just like it is for men. To be a scholar is not a gender-specific profession. But no scholar in Islamic history would have had an issue with culture. This is very important because it's difficult for many Muslims to understand that today, especially in the West, where often we are living as minorities that are alienated from ourselves and alienated from our tradition and alienated sometimes, often from the people around us. And this is very problematic, extremely. But because of this principle, which is something instituted by the Prophet ﷺ, then Islam created from the earliest period this incredible global culture in which Islam has been compared by scholars to a crystal clear river. And a crystal clear river, like the water in this glass, it has no color. But it will reflect the color of what it flows over. So therefore, Islam in China, and Islam has been in China as long as it's been in Syria, it looks Chinese, and yet it's very Islamic. And Islam in West Africa looked African. And Islam in Spain and Portugal looked Iberian, and so forth. So this is something we want to talk about today. And also, of course, this enabled Muslims to interact with people in a dynamic way. And given the situation that we live in today, the idea of Muslims being able to live in harmony with others and to benefit from other cultures and other civilizations would seem shocking, even perhaps to some Muslims. But in fact, historically, probably no other civilization or religious community was more gifted and more able to meet the people of the world, all of them, and to work with them than Muslims were. And again, it is this cultural dynamic of the law which is absolutely essential here. And when we look at the extremist Muslims today, and we will talk about that in Bochum tomorrow and then after that in Frankfurt, and we're going to emphasize that extremism is a complex matter. It's not a simple matter. But one of those complexities is their ideology. And that ideology takes different forms. But it has very little to do with the Islamic tradition. It has very little to do with Islamic law, although it will present itself as a law. And often, if you mix with the extremists or you know them, it's impossible for them to do anything in society. They can't mix, they have problems with dress, they have problems with gender, they have problems with women leading an organization, for example, and this is not the way that traditional Islam was. This is not the way that the law taught us to be. So, to begin, I want to show you some slides and just to give you a taste of this cultural genius that was typical of Islamic culture and Islamic civilization through history. And what happened? I'm in trouble. Pray for me. What happened to my pictures?
Time for commercial.
We'll just speak a little bit further until we get the pictures up so that we don't lose time. But I want to give you a few examples of what I call the cultural intelligence of the early Muslims. And to begin with, I want to tell you what is transmitted in our tradition. This is in fact in Sahih al-Bukhari, which is, as you all know, or most of you know, regarded to be the most authentic of all transmissions from the Prophet, peace be upon him, and from the companions. And in Bukhari, we're told the story of Amr ibn al-As, who, of course, is one of the companions of the Prophet. And Amr was also the commander of the armies that conquered Syria. And he fights against the Byzantines, because Syria was under the control of the Byzantines. And he's a brilliant commander, and the Muslims were very brilliant, in all of their battles. But one of the Sahaba comes to him and he tells him that the Prophet told us about the Byzantines. He told us about Ar-Rum. And really the word Rum, it can mean the Europeans, because that's the way Muslims understand it. We apply it to the Byzantines. It literally means the Romans, but we can use it for the Westerners. And he said that toward the end of time, the Rum, the Europeans, if you like, would be the majority of mankind. And we don't want to interpret what that means today, but we're all here dressed like Europeans. We're all here following European culture. We all belong to it in a certain way, even though we may or may not be of that ethnic background. So he was shocked. He said, "Is that true?" He said, "Yes." He said, "I heard the Prophet say that, sallallahu alaihi wasallam." So how did Amr respond? Again, he is fighting against the Byzantines. And they're very difficult to fight against. They're very good soldiers. They're Romans. And the Turks will be their heirs, by the way. The Ottoman Empire saw itself as the inheritor of Rome. And it takes many things over from the Romans, even military organization in some cases. But what does he say? He says, "If then what you have related is honestly true, like you told me the truth, then know that they, the Rum, the Byzantines, the Europeans, have 4 excellent qualities. So this is, to me, cultural genius. And it means also that he's not blinded by his faith from seeing the good that is in them. He said they have 4 excellent qualities. They are the most forbearing, the most patient. They are the most forbearing of people in times of trouble. They're strong in times of trouble. They are the quickest of people to recover from disaster. They have disaster, but they'll get back on their feet quickly. They are the most likely of people to renew the attack after retreat. That they will retreat, but they will attack you tomorrow or the next day. They'll be back. And they are the best of people toward the poor, the orphan, and the weak. So here's a man coming out of the Arabian desert. Of course, his people, Quraysh, they had known the Byzantines for hundreds of years. And in fact, his tribe, Quraysh, even had estates in Damascus in the pre-Islamic period. So these people are not foreign to them, as we might think. But look at that. He sees these 4 excellent qualities, and then he thinks about it a little. And then he says, no, there's also a 5th quality. So he's thinking about it. He says they have a 5th attribute, which is both beautiful and excellent. I mean, really, isn't this nice? Look at the way that he looks at them. This is his enemy. He said they have a 5th attribute, which is both beautiful and excellent. They are the best of people in checking the oppression of kings. They are the best people in seeking political freedom, in other words. So let's go through these slides just to give you a look at the peacock's tail. As some people have said, Islamic civilization produced a peacock's tail that spread from the east to the west, all the way from China to the Atlantic Ocean in Spain and Portugal and West Africa, taking on many colors, many beautiful colors, but there's one tail, there's one design, and there's one peacock. So, first of all, I want to start with this. And this is not Muslim, this is Russian Orthodox. And this is, of course, St. Basil's Basilica in Red Square in Moscow. Very beautiful. And you would probably agree that this is, more than anything else, the logo of Russia. Right? Whenever you have advertisements to come to Russia, you'll almost certainly see St. Basil's. Is that a good shot? Can you see it all right? Why would I put this here? Well, it has a history. It does look funky, doesn't it? It looks strange, doesn't it? And where did this come from? The Volga River, the Mother Volga, which is the heart of Russia, and in some would say the heart of Europe, because if you control the Volga, they used to say, you can control Europe. But the Volga River was controlled for hundreds of years in the wake of Genghis Khan by the Golden Horde. And the Golden Horde were Tatars. They were Tatars, and they became Muslim. And so they had many cities in Russia, and they controlled the Volga, the upper Volga, the middle Volga, the lower Volga, what we called Stalingrad or Volgograd. You know, that was Sarai. It was Sarai. It was their main capital. And so this actually gives us the only example that we know of a Tatar mosque. Because when Ivan the Terrible, Ivan Grozny, when he begins to create the Russian Empire in the 1500s, he will begin by conquering the Volga from the Golden Horde. And he begins with the upper Volga, and he gets to the middle Volga. And in the middle Volga, there is a great city. I've had the honor to visit it, which is Kazan. And Kazan was the capital of the Tatars of the middle Volga. And they had, like Muslims often have, they have popular mosques, mosques that you'd find in the village, in the countryside, and then they have the Jami'. They have the great mosque where you pray Jumu'ah. And usually we will see that the typical people's mosque is going to be different. And the Jami' will be special. This is the way it was in Spain and Portugal. This is the way it is in many countries in Islamic history. In Tatar lands, the little mosques looked like Orthodox Russian churches. And these Ivan the Terrible did not destroy. But we don't know what their Jami' looks like, but their Jami' was made of these bricks, these tiles, these kind of domes. And when Ivan Grozny conquered Kazan, he said, wait, don't destroy this. He destroyed all of the Jawami' and most of the mosques. And he forced the Tatars, by the way, to become Orthodox. But he said, take this to Moscow and build me a basilica. So this is Christian architecture. But again, the tiles, the bricks, these are Tatar. And why would I give this example? I give this example because the Russians must love this. They must be able to relate to it. There's something about it, if we can be romantic, that appeals to the Russian soul. And this is why they made it their logo. This is why this is one of the things that they are most proud of. And yet this is a mosque. And it shows you that the Tatars were building architecture that was in harmony with the Russians that were around them and the cultures that they lived in. And now I want to go to the next slide. You've probably seen it already. Oh, well, I don't know if I can do better than that. Whoops. Okay, I can do a little bit better. And of course, you all know this is the Acropolis of Athens. And this is the Parthenon, which is one of the most beautiful pieces of architecture that human beings ever built. And it was, in fact, Arnold Toynbee, the great English thinker and historian, he says the most beautiful buildings of all, in his mind, are the Parthenon and the Blue Mosque of Istanbul. He said, these are perfect. And of course, there are other beautiful buildings in history. For many Muslims, architecture was the master of the arts. They would say that architecture is to art as metaphysics is to thought. So what about the Acropolis? Why do we put that there? Because when the Ottoman Turks ruled Greece, which was for many centuries, they made that their Jami'. The Jami' mosque, the big mosque of Athens, and Greece was 50% Muslim under the Ottomans, by the way. And what we call today Turkey, Anatolia, was only 50% Muslim. Greece and Anatolia were very similar. About 50% of the people of what is today Turkey were Greek-speaking, sometimes Armenian and Christian, and about 50% were Muslim during the strong period of the Ottoman Empire. And Greece itself is about 50% Muslim and also 50% Orthodox Christian. But again, they took that, and it wasn't, in those days, by the way, the Parthenon was intact. It wasn't a ruin. It's a beautiful ruin today, but it was intact in the Ottoman period. And they built it into a beautiful mosque, which respected also the way that it had always looked. They didn't want to change that. In fact, if you look at Ottoman mosques or Muslim mosques in the Mediterranean, where sometimes the Muslims would take over an island and they would get the churches of that island. There were maybe no Christians left. And they would turn the church into a mosque. They would do it very respectfully. They wouldn't destroy any frescoes or pictures. They might put white over them, but they didn't destroy them. We have beautiful photographs of that also. So again here, this is an example, in my belief, of this cultural intelligence. That you're among the Greeks. The Orthodox Church, which the Ottomans adopted, by the way, the relations between the Greek Orthodox Church and the Ottoman Empire were extremely good. And the Ottomans brought about also good reforms in the Orthodox Church. The Orthodox Church remained loyal to the Ottoman Empire until the end. You wouldn't necessarily believe that today after what we saw in Bosnia and Serbia and so forth, but it was that way in the past. But again, the Greek Orthodox Church, they had no objection, because for them, this is pagan. And so therefore they don't want it. They don't want to make that into a church. But for the Ottomans, no, this is an excellent, beautiful building, beautifully located, and then also it does respect tremendously the ethos of Hellenic civilization. Now we go through some, okay, so we go to Indonesia. This is just one Indonesian mosque. It's an old Indonesian mosque, and we could look at lots of other Indonesian and Malayan mosques. But when Islam came into Indonesia and into Malaya, this was a Hindu-Buddhist civilization. And the Hindu-Buddhist culture of Indonesia had affected everything, the symbols, the colors, the interpretations. And so the first mosques that were built, this is not necessarily the best example of that, but they were what we call cosmic mountains, because this is the way the Buddhist Hindu temples were there. You have 4 poles that go up in a square, then you have a first roof, and then you usually have an opening, which you don't have here, but you have an opening that allows for air. It makes the temperature cooler. Then you have a second roof, which is smaller. Again, usually you'll have an opening, and then you have a third roof above that that is similar to that roof that you have on the top. Again, what you see is that these Muslims going into Indonesia and Malaysia, they adopt the sacred symbols of that culture, and they build their own sacred architecture in a way that respects the tradition that was there. There's nothing wrong with that. And again, so they create something which in the eyes of the other people is also sacred and is also respectable. And it is not culturally predatory. It does not deny them their identity. It does not deny them their past. Here we have Indonesian shadow puppets. This is maybe better. And these puppets were developed by one of the great saints of Indonesia. His name was Kali Jaga, the protector of the rivers. He was an amazing man and a cultural genius, among other things. But he redefines the symbolism of Indonesian culture, and he used the puppets. First of all, he created these puppets. Not necessarily the one in the middle, but he wanted to teach Islam. And how do you do that? Puppets. Puppet shows. And they would teach everything about Islam through puppet shows. And he even developed the art of his type of puppet show. And the person does it has to have wudu. And they will use gamelan music. And they will sing a little bit. They will talk a little bit. And they made up stories which are not necessarily authentic, such as the encounter between Hamza and Krishna, or the encounter between Yusuf alayhi salam and Vishnu. But this way they teach, the teachings and the values. And most Indonesian rice peasants, who were the vast majority of the population, they learned Islam from puppets and from puppet shows. Even Kali Jaga helped them with rice farming. And he developed a new technique, I was told, of rice farming. I had the great honor to meet his great-great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter. And I told her, oh, I know about Kali Jaga. And she said, what do you know? And I said this, and she said, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's right, that's right, that's wrong. So I learned more about this great man. In fact, when he first did the puppets, there was another saint of Indonesia whose name is Sunan Giri. And Sunan Giri told him, this is haram. This is haram. You cannot do this. And he said, wait a minute. So he went back. First he was using traditional Malay puppets. You know, and this one in the middle is more like a traditional Malay puppet. But then he created his own, which are actually, this is not the best example, but they're very skinny. And they have thin necks and long noses and so forth. And then he said to Sunan Giri, could this ever live? Could this ever be a living being? And he said, I don't think so. He said, this will be my puppets then. And so he creates a puppet that is not going to bother Sunan Giri. Then we go from here to India. This is the beautiful Taj Mahal. All of you know about this. Is that not the logo of India? Is that not the logo of India? So they got it right again, didn't they? They got it right. They built something that the Hindus and the Jains and the Parsis and the Muslims, unless they're extremists, find beautiful. Okay, what happened? What did I do? Thank you. All right. Maybe you should stick around, okay? All right, so, okay, I'm back to where I was before. You stick around. You know what you're doing, inshallah. And you can stand up, there's no problem. All right? So here we go. We'll stop there. That's good. And don't run away. All right, so this is, again, an example of the oldest mosque. This is, of course, in a museum, and it's a replica. But this is perhaps the oldest mosque in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, in South Asia. This goes back to the early 8th century, maybe the 7th century. And this is in Kerala. Kerala is a beautiful part of the world. It is eastern India. And beautiful mountains and rivers and incredible foods and herbs and good medicine, by the way, and other things. But Islam comes early on to Kerala because it comes by the sea, through traders, through merchants. And again, this is not the best example. They have 13 mosques like this, or 14. I visited a number of them, but many of them are cosmic mountains. Again, because again, you have a similar culture there. And so you have the 4 pillars, you have the 3 layers. That's not a good example of that. It's not a bad example either. But again, one of the things very important is that southern India and northern India are radically different. Different people, different languages, different culture, even different Hinduism. And this happens to be a type of mosque that fits in beautifully with the Hindu culture of southern India. And then we want to go again to the Taj Mahal. I don't have a whole lot to say about it. You don't have to be told that it's beautiful. But here, the Mughals, they build something, of course, very different. But this is northern India. Northern India has a different ethos. This fits in northern India. Whereas the other mosques, this wouldn't really necessarily fit in southern India, by the way. And this is one of the things that happens now, is that Muslims are building mosques in the south that are like this, and the southerners don't necessarily like it. The Hindus do the same thing. The Hindus bring down temples from the north, which jar with the type of culture that you have in the south. But in any case, this is, of course, beautiful, and it is something that pleases the ethos of all Indians, whether they are Muslims or Hindus, and the Mughals, who were brilliant rulers, they were very sensitive to these things. Of course, politically they had to be. How are you going to rule a Hindu majority if you don't give them something in return, if you don't acknowledge the greatness that they have? One of the things that I will mention here, just in passing, this is not about culture. Maybe it's not about culture, but just as we respect the cultures of people, we also respect nature, the mountains, the water, the trees, and so forth. The Ottoman Empire, and many of you are Turks, as you know, the sycamore tree has in the Ottoman Empire an extremely important symbolic value. And so the tree, and in fact, I mean, I've seen in Bursa a sycamore that goes back to the first days of the Ottomans in the early 1300s, and that tree is still alive. It's huge. And, you know, they prop it up, they take care of it, they doctor it, they keep it healthy after all these hundreds of years. This is part of our culture also, part of our civilization. But one of the things we will say about Islamic architecture, and this is one of the secrets of its beauty, as opposed, forgive me for saying this, but as opposed to the Bauhaus. And Bauhaus architecture is a very modernistic form, you probably know that is created in Germany in the wake of the world wars. And, you know, one of the purposes of Bauhaus architecture is to get rid of architecture haunted by God. Really, this is what they would say. You can study the history of architecture, that these old houses in Germany, many of which, of course, were destroyed by the war, but they're haunted by God. We actually like them to be haunted by God. But one of the secrets of this type of architecture is that it is tectonic. Tectonic. How do you say tectonic auf Deutsch? You don't know. Does anybody know? Tectonic. Tektonisch? Tektonisch? I don't know. Tectonic is a difficult word. Most people who speak English would have no idea. What did he just say? But tectonic means it fits the earth. It fits the earth. It is built to fit, to match the earth, to be in harmony with the earth. And of course, much traditional architecture is like that. Zen architecture is tectonic. But again, this is something that is not the same as the cultural imperative, but at the same time, I think it is, because we respect also the nature around us. And if we could talk about architecture, if you go to Spain or Portugal and you look at the old Moorish houses, some of them are so tectonic, you wouldn't believe it. I have seen houses in Granada that are Moorish, that go back hundreds of years, and they're built on a little hill, and they fit the hill perfectly. They didn't cut any part of the hill. They didn't dig out any part of the hill. They honored the hill, believing, of course, that God created the hill. And then they build their house around the hill, and those houses, the one I have in mind, the light, the lighting, the airflow is just incredible. They're just, you feel so happy in those houses. And, you know, so you see that in the Taj Mahal. How many people have visited the Taj Mahal? How many of you have visited the Taj Mahal? I can't believe that. This is Germany. Aren't you world travelers? I go to West Africa, and there always be Germans coming there, you know, in their big buses, you know, with their tents and everything else. But, you know, this is really, of course, something you'd like to visit. And I was able to go to the Taj Mahal, and my friend who took me there, he said, we will wait and go on the night of the full moon. So we were there on the day before that. It's really spectacular. And it's an architectural wonder. There's much more to it than what you see here. And it's like the whole thing turns. You feel it turning. And on the night of the full moon, it's just beyond words. And again, tectonic architecture, especially I would say Islamic architecture, but this would be true of other beautiful forms of architecture. And Zen architecture, Japanese is what comes to my mind. But even though it's beautiful beyond words, but it's not saying, here am I. And this is what modern architecture, and of course in the modern world we do have beautiful architecture. And you have many architects who are striving to bring beauty into our cities and so forth. But the worst examples of modern architecture, the building is say, look at me. Look at me, you can't look away. Look at me, even if I'm ugly, look at me. And this traditional architecture is always saying, you know, look at other things also. Look at the heavens, look at the earth, look at the water, breathe the air. Now we want to go to China, and Islam has been in China 1,400 years. Islam came to China before, at the same time that it came to Syria, the same time it came to Iran, the same time that it came to Iraq and to Spain and to Portugal. And again, what did the Chinese do with it? And they created an architecture endorsed by the emperor, with the permission of the emperor, with the colors of the emperor, but an architecture which is totally Chinese and yet totally Muslim. These are among the most beautiful mosques in the world. I've been there twice. They say that if you want to know if a mosque is beautiful or good or not, then go into it, pray, and see if you want to leave. If you don't want to leave, it's a good mosque. It's well done. And the Chinese mosques are like that. Many of the Ottoman mosques are like that as well. You don't want to leave. You could stay there forever. So again, they bring in the Chinese elements. And this is, here you're going into the garden. The gardens often have Zen principles. And they're meant to take the anxiety out of your mind, to take the worry out of your mind, so that when you go to the mosque and that man is coming out of the mosque, you can focus on your prayer. And you can get the world out of your hearts. And here is, what is that? Anyone want to guess? It's part of the mosque. Allahu Akbar. This is the minaret. This is the minaret. Again, the Swiss don't want Turkish minarets, but you could give them a Swiss minaret, couldn't you? I mean, you have to respect their cultures. You have to respect their cultures. And so this is a Chinese minaret. Again, it's not very tall. And that has to do also with, you know, the principles of China, because the Chinese don't like tall buildings. And they didn't build very tall buildings. And you don't have to have many minarets. You can have just one. In fact, the minaret, like the Persian minaret, what was it developed for? What was its architectural purpose? Of course, they want to call the adhan from a high place, but the word manara in Arabic means what? What does it mean? Manara, place of fire. Place of fire. And this is because in those minarets, they would build bonfires in the tops of the minarets, and they would light them at night. Why would they do that? So that caravans can see where the city is. And then also they can signal with the fires as well, if they have to do that, for example, in times of war or times of disaster. But, so these are, and then here we come into southern China. A Muslim culture in China is divided at the Yangtze River, which is the river that goes through Shanghai. And that mosque that you just saw, those are northern Chinese mosques. And when you come into southern China, beginning in Shanghai, then you find another culture. And of course, it's very Chinese, very similar, but you notice that they don't use the same colors. Here the colors will be white, black, and red. Those are the dominant colors. This is because of the culture there. Actually, if you go into China and you go into Western China, I have had the honor to be there. There, the mosques, again, they're Chinese, but they tend to imitate Tibetan pagodas, because that's the land of Tibetan Buddhism. And, so they also have a different type of style. And this mosque here in Shanghai, the Songjiang Mosque, as it's called, I had the honor to go there. It's really one of the most beautiful places on the earth. And although we couldn't get a good picture, we sort of put this together hastily. But that wall on the outside, and now you're going in, this is the outside, it has a dragon that goes all along the wall. And this is the dragon right here. You can't really make it out. But that wall, on top of it, is an architectural dragon. And what does the dragon mean? It means this mosque is protected by the emperor. So don't do anything wrong here. Don't steal, don't destroy anything. And this is very important because Islam in China was one of the emperor's religions. It was an official religion of China. And the Muslims played a very important role in the Chinese state. This is the inside of that mosque. It's very, very beautiful. And here I just wanted to end the Chinese part with this, that this is, of course, Arabic calligraphy. The way that the Arabic is done is Chinese. The Chinese developed their own style of writing Arabic, just as the Persians and the Andalusians and others, they developed their own styles of writing Arabic. There's nothing wrong with that. And Chinese Arabic calligraphy, like Arabic calligraphy everywhere, is an art. Of course, even today in Turkey, you have some of the best calligraphers in the world. Very good calligraphers. But the Chinese have a whole system of how to do this calligraphy. For example, they like to not lift the pen from the paper. And so when he did this, La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah, there is no God but God, Muhammad is the messenger of God, he probably only lifted his pen once or twice. This is the way they do it. And they do it very fast. And then, of course, at the same time, they cultivate traditional Chinese calligraphy. And they're masters of that as well. So they have the calligraphy of the Chinese, the calligraphy of the Arabs, and in the Chinese, which will be classical Chinese, they tell you about what this Arabic says. And here we can say a few more words, that when Islam came into China, one of the problems that it faced was, how do you talk about Islam in Chinese? Chinese is a very different kind of language. And if you say Islam, it's very difficult for the Chinese to say that. They will usually say Yisilan, Yisilan. And then also, if they're going to spell the sounds Yisilan, they have to use different characters, and it looks really funny. It looks really funny. So one of the things they did was also develop new language. And although they know what Islam means and they call themselves Muslims, but they will call their religion Qing Jian Jiao. Qing Jian Jiao. The religion of the real and the pure. The religion of the real and the pure. Okay? That's brilliant. And they will also, like for example, we say in Arabic, the unseen, al-ghaib. And we say alam al-shahada, the world of what is visible and seen. So that also is somewhat of a problem in Chinese. And so they would say the world of the seen is the color world. And the world of the unseen is no color world. And because this, like in the Chinese understanding of things, that's the way they would say that. If you say the unseen, that doesn't really work. It's not going, you say no color world, oh, you can't see anything there, can you? And, So again, they worked with their language, and I've had, the opportunity to visit China twice, as I mentioned. The first time that we went there, our guides were from Inner Mongolia, and they were Chinese Muslims, fantastic people. The second time that we went, our guides were Chinese, and many of them had never been in a mosque before. They didn't know much about the Muslims, although they organized the trip for us, and they were extremely good. But when we would go into the mosques, what were they doing? Well, first of all, they're dazzled. And secondly, they're reading all the Chinese, because you have Chinese in the mosque. You have Chinese language there. And it will say for Qing Jian Jiao, religion of the real and the pure. Then it will say in 4 characters, primordial religion from the foundation of heaven. That this is the primordial religion from the foundation of heaven. Even when the Muslims began to write in China, they say that when we came to China, we found in the legacy of Confucius and of the Taoists that much of the ancient wisdom was still there. And so we just brought that back to life, and we gave it what it had lost. So again, they're not trying to destroy that. And one of the greatest thinkers in China, whose name is Wan Daiju and Liu Ji, 2 of them, they in the 16th and 17th century faced the problem of teaching Islam to Chinese Muslims, many of whom are in the government, and they receive classical Chinese educations. And it's very difficult for them to understand not just Arabic and Persian. Persian for them, by the way, is a sacred language. But it's very difficult for them to understand the mentality of Arabic or the mentality of Persian, especially if they have a classical Chinese education. So they write everything in Chinese, and they explain everything in Chinese in a way that makes sense to a Muslim. It makes sense to a Buddhist, a Pure Land Buddhist, that was the dominant school, to a Neo-Confucianist, that was the dominant Confucianist school, and then also to a Taoist. Again, being relevant to your culture. I have an article called Seek Knowledge in China, Thinking Outside the Abrahamic Box. And if you're interested in that, you can look at it. So now we go, to Turkey. I just like to show you this. Tectonic architecture? Tectonic architecture? Could you give me a better example? Isn't that beautiful? It fits the mountain perfectly. And this is typical of the Islamic world. Not just in Turkey, it was in Afghanistan, in everywhere that you went. So it fits into the world that it belongs to. And then we look here, this is of course Konya, and most all of you, if not every single one of you, knows that this is the tomb of Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi in Konya, and this is of course pre-Ottoman. This is Seljuk. But the Seljuk mosque and also this mausoleum, they imitate, and they did this consciously, they imitate Armenian Christian architecture. And therefore, this is an Armenian church, and I think you can see the similarity. And if you look at Seljuk Mosque, you'll see that this is much more often the case. It's always the case. So again, it's like there's no allergy. They're not allergic to Christianity. They're not allergic to the Armenian church. In fact, they respect it because the Armenians were the most loyal of all the minorities in the Ottoman Empire up until the 19th century. And the Ottomans loved the Armenians, and the Armenians loved the Ottomans, and that's not an exaggeration. We study about this in history. So also here you see the creation of a culture. A lot of that is Ottoman, by the way, but the creation of a culture that is going to be friendly to the culture around it. And because it's friendly to the culture around it, it can also communicate to that culture. Now here's, of course, an Ottoman mosque. And, most of you might be Turks. I know there are a lot of Turks here. And you know much more about this than I do. But the Ottoman mosque also consciously imitated what? Hagia Sophia. Hagia Sophia, which is, of course, an Ottoman mosque because there were very few Christians left in Constantinople when the Ottomans took it over. And usually when the Muslims would take over a great church, they negotiate with the Christian community. In the case of Cordoba, for example, they pay them to take over that church. In Damascus, we have a similar story of the great mosque in Damascus that was a Christian church for a long time. The Christians continued to use half of the mosque and the Muslims used the other half until the Muslims became so numerous and the Muslims had to negotiate with them. Can we buy this from you? Can we have the rights to use it? But here you have, of course, one of the greatest Christian churches ever, one of the earliest Christian churches ever, begun by Constantine the Great. And the Ottomans take that over, but the Ottoman mosque is always patterned on the Greek Orthodox Church, and in a way that honors the Greek Orthodox tradition. And if you know about the history of the Ottoman Empire, the relations between the Greek Orthodox and the Ottomans were always very strong. And this was true of other minorities. The Jews, for example, they found refuge in Istanbul and in the Turks like they had never found anywhere in Europe. And of course they had similar situations elsewhere in the world, but they were invited to Istanbul and they were protected. This is the inside of Hagia Sophia, and again it was turned into a mosque, but they were very careful with what they did with all of the Byzantine ornamentations and everything else. And they did not destroy them. Sometimes, yes, they covered them with whitewash. And sometimes they painted other things on them. But again, they want to respect that past. And this is very important because part of our tradition, and you see this clearly in the Ottoman Empire, is to respect the tradition of all people that were before you. And therefore, they would preserve the Buddhas of Bamiyan, the great Buddhas of Bamiyan that the Taliban tried to destroy. You know, how were they there in the first place? They stayed there, they were there for how many hundreds of years under the presence of, because we would never destroy things like that. This was not part of our religion. This is a radical ideology that is culturally predatory and that is not at home with the world that it lives in and knows nothing about history. So here you have that. Now I'm going to finish up in a few minutes, but Islam in West Africa, they wanted their mosques to look African. And in fact, we have stories of Mansa Kankan Musa, the emperor of Mali, who when he made pilgrimage around 1325, he had so much gold. Mali was the center of gold in the world. He took so much gold with him that he caused inflation in Cairo for more than 12 years. But when he goes to the pilgrimage, then he also hires architects. And some of these were Andalusian architects. And he says, come back to Mali and build me mosques, but they will look African. Isn't that amazing? He doesn't want to have an Andalusian mosque in Africa. And they would come back and they would build these, and you have a whole architectural tradition. And again, the area where this mosque is built, you know, in Timbuktu and in these other cities, this is, as you know, desert area. So they're going to build from adobe, and they do it in a brilliant way. Really, these pieces of wood, they don't look ugly, but they're there so that you can always repair the mosque, because you have to keep the adobe, you have to keep patching it up, and so therefore you don't have to always put up a scaffold and a ladder. But again, it looks very beautiful to my eyes anyway. And now I wanted here to get a photograph of a beautiful mosque in Germany. Where is that mosque?
Penzberg.
Where?
Penzberg.
Penzberg. And that's in Bavaria? Or? Yeah. Okay. So Penzberg, and maybe you all know that mosque, but it's a very beautiful mosque in my opinion. And also it has big windows, and big windows are a good thing to have today. The Ottomans, of course, have big windows on their mosques. whereas the Seljuks didn't. And one of the reasons why the Ottomans have big windows is to give people the message that you're safe, and we are safe, and we are in control. There's nothing to fear. Whereas with the Seljuks, it wasn't like that. You know, they're always in danger because it's still an early period. And it may be that all the people have to be put in the mosque and locked in there to be protected. So therefore, they'll have windows, but they won't have big windows. But the Ottomans would say big windows because there's nothing to fear. We're in control. But today, windows are very important because it means we have nothing to hide. Look in, see what we're doing. You know, we're not making bombs. Here, this is a rug, and it's made by a friend of mine, and she is a professional. She has an old loom, and she makes her own cloth, and she works all day, and she loves to do it. But she made this carpet, and the important thing about it is that she made this in a way that incorporated design patterns of the First Nations of Alberta, of Western Canada, the Indians, the First Nations. And she wanted to have a prayer rug that fit into Canada in her view and that also respects the First Nations of that land. And here we have another Canadian mosque. The Canadians are doing amazing things, but this mosque also has won awards because of the way that it fits in, they believe, with the trees and with the forests. And then you have also the woodwork inside the mosque, which is based on patterns of the First Nations. In fact, the workers who did this were Indians. They were Canadian Indians of the First Nations of Canada, and they were overjoyed to be able to do this. And here we're getting close to the end. This is one of my really good friends, Aziz Ibrahim, and he is an amazing man. But that is, of course, a tartan. And you all know about Scots and tartans, don't you? You have the McGregor tartan, and you've got the Bennett tartan, and you've got the Armstrong tartan. And what tartan is this? What family is this? What family is this? It's not the McGregors, and it's not the Bennetts. Blue represents the Scottish flag. Green represents Islam. The 5 white lines represent the 5 pillars of Islam. The Shahada, prayer, fasting, pilgrimage, and zakat, alms. The gold lines, which are 6, are the 6 pillars of faith, and then the black square represents the Kaaba. So this is then a Muslim tartan, you know, for the Muslims of Scotland. And Scotland is one of those countries that is extremely gracious, very good hosts, very open-minded. I think that they're one of the best examples in Europe. But again, this kind of a thing, this is not haram. This is the kind of thing that we do. This is even, you can say, obligatory. There's nothing wrong with the tartan. There's nothing rejected by that. And so this is like we would like to have a Scottish identity in the context of our Islamic identity. Let's talk a little bit. How are we doing for time? We have time? Okay. So I want to talk a little bit more about what our jurists say about culture. And of course we have these maxims, these qawa'id kulliyah. And one of those maxims is al-'adatu tabi'atun thaniya, that cultural convention is second nature. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit because, of course, it shows us how important culture is. What is more difficult than changing your culture? And as a rule, we do not ask people to do that. You know, we respect the cultures of the places that we go to. And to ask a person to change their nature is not an easy thing to do. At the same time, we know that as cultures develop, they have in them good developments and bad. And those of us who come from the traditional Muslim world, we bring with us a lot of culture. That's natural. And we want to also keep a lot of traditional culture, and that's all right. You don't have to give up your past and your identity. No, you have a right to keep your identity and your culture. But sometimes, you know, the baggage we bring is not good. Sometimes we have cultural conventions that pertain to things like marriage, for example, that just don't work. I remember a man whom I like. He lives in Dubai, and he's from Sri Lanka. And he's so proud, you know, he had his whole family there with me. And he said, you know, all of us are married to people from the same city, and from the same street, and from the same side of the street. I mean, it's like, isn't this amazing? Isn't this great? And here are his daughters, like, and how are we going to get married? How are we going to get married? I mean, in Sri Lanka that may have worked, but this doesn't work in Dubai. And then, of course, you know, we come to the United States or Canada, and I don't know a whole lot about your community, and I like to learn about you and about your community. But we have these problems all the time. It's very difficult for a person to find a spouse. It's very difficult for our sisters to find husbands in many cases. And one of my great accomplishments in life, I might say, is that I was able to facilitate, you know, the marriage of a Syrian young man, you know, to an Indian young woman. And that wasn't easy. And it should have been no case. It should have been nothing. There's another case where I lost. And this was a young man who comes from India, from Hyderabad, beautiful city, and he wanted to marry a wonderful sister in the same province who comes from Lebanon, and his family, and that's a good Lebanese family, and his family would not have it that your wife will come from Hyderabad. And it's like, and where do I find her? And who is she going to be? And why is she better than this woman? And she's probably not going to be. So this is cultural baggage, isn't it? And this is not good. This is not good at all. But again, we have to look at the maxim, culture is second nature. So when we want to change these things, then understand that that will not be easy. And understand also that we will have to have strategies, and we'll have to go about it carefully, and there has to be education, and there have to be good precedents, and so forth. But again, just as we accept good culture, we should not accept bad culture. And yet, if we don't accept bad culture, don't think that you can change it overnight. People are just not like that. You know, my wife is here. I'm honored to have her with me on this trip. I hope it's not bad for me to say this, but she's a great educator. And one of her close friends in an Islamic school is a Quran teacher and a good Muslim. And her son was about to get married. And he's going to marry a young girl of her ethnic background also. And she said, now I can do to her what they did to me. And my wife was startled. And she said, you don't mean that, do you? I said, no. Like I was treated so badly by my mother-in-law, and now I can do the same thing to her. It's like, where is your mind? And like, where is your Quran? And where are you as a human being? And it's as if she couldn't understand that. And this is shocking to us, isn't it? But al-'ada tabi'atun thaniya. culture is a second nature. So therefore our scholars are also telling us that don't think you can change it easily. And if you change it, you have to change it wisely, and you want to make it better and better. In the Quran you have a verse, the verse which is in the 7th surah, verse 199, وَأْمُرْ بِالْ and it says, وَخُذْ بِالْعَفْوِ, yeah. It says, except, and this is my translation based on tafsir, except, I would say from people, what comes naturally. خُذْ بِالْعَفْوِ. Except from people what comes naturally for them. This is one of the interpretations of that. Command al-ma'ruf. Command what is good, but ma'ruf is what is customarily good. That's what it means. And command what is customarily good. And turn away from the ignorant, meaning without responding in kind. And Ibn Atiyah, who's a great Andalusian jurist, in his interpretation of that verse, he said that this verse upholds the sanctity of indigenous culture, and it grants sweeping validity to everything the human heart regards as sound and beneficial, as long as it is not clearly repudiated or rejected by revealed law. Human beings are not fools. We are not idiots. And of course we benefit greatly from revelation. But that doesn't mean that we don't know how to build houses and we don't know how to organize our lives or how to make our clothing or whatever it may be. So he said that's what this verse is also teaching us. That human beings know a lot about what is good for them. So you don't come into a society and say, change everything. You know, this is all foreign to me. It's all got to go. And this verse is one that the traditional scholars quote when they talk about the importance of culture. Let's look at Abu Yusuf. And most people here are probably Hanafis, and you probably know about Abu Yusuf and Abu Hanifa, radiallahu anhum, and Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani, the great three of the Hanafi school. Abu Yusuf is, of course, the student of Abu Hanifa. And Abu Yusuf understood, as other jurists did, that when the Prophet ﷺ established his teaching, he accepted from the culture that was before him everything that was good. He did not come in and forbid everything and start all over again. And he will only change things when they have to be changed. And even if people come to him from other parts of Arabia who have different types of cultures, he will leave that as it is. He will change the things that need to be changed. And in this view, Abu Yusuf understood that the recognition of good local cultural norms falls under the rubric, under the heading of the Sunnah. That al-'ada muhakkama, good convention, has the power of law, meaning it has the power of the Sunnah. People say, this is not the Sunnah, this is not the Sunnah. No, if it is good culture and you accept it, it is the Sunnah. When we go to China and we do the good things the Chinese do, that's endorsed by the Sunnah. This was the pattern of what the Prophet was doing, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We cannot be rigid and literal in these kind of things. As-Sarakhsi, who is one of the great Hanafi jurists and legal scholars, he emphasizes the same thing that Abu Yusuf teaches us. And he says, whatever is established by sound custom is equally well established by sound legal proof. So in other words, don't think like, but is this okay? No, of course it cannot be in conflict with what we believe. We won't accept it then, but we don't tell the other people you can't do that because this is not our business. Islamic law never imposes itself on non-Muslims. It cannot do that. It's not allowed to do that. In an Islamic state, the non-Muslims will have their own laws. They will have their own courts. They will only come to an Islamic court for certain types of cases that are between them and Muslims, or that might pertain to things like treason. Otherwise, they have their own courts. They have their own laws. They have their own educational system. And we accept what we want, and we don't accept what we don't like. But we don't tell them, you can't do this. This is haram. No, it's not haram for them. It's haram for you. And you let them live their lives as they are, and you respect that, and you live in harmony with them. Whatever is established by sound custom is equally well established by sound legal proof. Again, meaning that Islamic law implicitly endorses all cultural conventions that are good according to our standards. And of course, there's many things that are good according to their standards that we would say, I'm sorry, we don't want to do that. Please excuse us for this. I don't want to drink this glass of wine. And I don't care if it's red wine or white wine. I don't want this wine. But we don't say, but you can't drink it either. No, that's not your right. That's not your right to do that. We have the example in the prophetic sunnah in the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where there came to Medina, the city of the Prophet, a number of Ethiopian converts to Islam, Africans. And these came with Ja'far at-Tayyar when he came to Medina from the Hijrah to Ethiopia. And these Ethiopians, when Islam is talking about the beautiful aspects of the Christians, it's talking about the Ethiopians. And when it's talking about bad aspects of the Christians, it's talking about the Christians of Najran in southern Arabia. And it's very important to know that because there's always a context. When it's talking about the Jews, it's not talking about the Jews of Germany in 1930. It's talking about the Jews of Medina. And if you know Arabic, you know how this works. But in any case, in the Eid, after fasting, these Ethiopians were excited and happy. They're in joy that they cannot contain. And they get out drums and they begin to beat their drums, and they get their swords and their spears and they begin to do sword dancing and spear dancing. And the people gather around to watch. And Umar ibn al-Khattab, whom I love very much, but he's very much an Arab and a Qurashi. He doesn't know this, and he says, you can't do this. Stop. And the Prophet ﷺ tells him, take it easy, Umar. I said, take it easy. And he said, and then in one transmission he said, let them play their games. And in one transmission he says, so that the Jews and Christians know that we have ampleness, we have ease in our religion. We're not rigid people. And Aisha, his wife, she wanted to watch too, and she was too short, so the Prophet put her up on his shoulder so that she could watch as long as she wanted. So this is also an incredible example of culture in the life of the Prophet ﷺ. And here we see many things, but one of the most important things we see is that these Ethiopians are allowed to remain Ethiopians. And the fact that they have accepted Islam doesn't mean they have to give up their black identity, their African identity. In the United States, Islam began to spread after World War I. In World War I, the United States had to bring large numbers of blacks out of the South. Most of the blacks were in the South. And it had to bring them to the North because they couldn't get immigrants to work. It was war. And so you begin to create the black ghettos of the northern cities. And then in World War II, this becomes a major necessity because the United States has to produce its war machine. And it doesn't have immigrant labor to do that with, so they have to have the black labor. And when the blacks of the North begin to live there, they have greater freedom. They don't have freedom. It's a segregated society, apartheid. But they have greater freedom than they had in the South, and they can also study about themselves. And where do we come from? And we're Africans. All that was taken away by slavery. And a lot of them begin to discover Islam. And Islam begins to spread among them, sometimes in orthodox fashion, often in unorthodox fashion. But usually in this period, they're very intelligent with culture, even though they didn't study this. And if you look at the so-called Nation of Islam, which was directed by Elijah Muhammad, there are many theological mistakes in what he did, but cultural mistakes, almost none. And he created a dynamic culture for the African American Muslim that would make them respected in society and would enable them also to be connected to their African American past. And this is the way that Islam was developing in the United States until certain ideological strains came into the community. And then they would say, this is haram, this is haram, this is haram, this is bid'ah, this is bid'ah. And they broke that completely. And they virtually destroyed Islam in the inner city, even though they had no problems with drugs. They had no problems with other things. Isn't that strange? This is a big problem that we face right now. So the sons of Arfida, this is what this is called, the Ethiopians. This is very, very important. I'm going to just give you a few more quotations, and hopefully then we can open up for discussion. This is a great judge. His name is Abd-allah al-Baghdadi. He's a great judge and a great legal authority. And he says, the rejection of cultural usage, good cultural usage is what he means, has no meaning at all. It's nonsense. For you to reject the good culture around you is nonsense. Don't think that's Islam. Don't pat yourself on the back for that. You don't know what you're doing. He says the rejection of good cultural usage has no meaning at all. To follow sound custom is an obligation. Ash-Shatibi, who's another one of the great jurists, he also, he says that to go against sound cultural conventions of people is to impose very harsh difficulties upon them, and it is incompetence. It is ignorance of Islam. It is not knowledge of Islam. It is not piety to do that. And he insisted that the art of handing down legal judgments, fatwas, must be in harmony with the good aspects of the local culture of that area. And that this is the way that we buttress, we strengthen the society's well-being. I'll take one more quotation. Another jurist named At-Tasuli, he says, allowing the people to follow their good customs and usages and general aspirations in life. What do they want? What do you want to do with your life? Of course you want to do what's good, you don't want to do what's bad, but you have to let people to follow their general aspirations in life is obligatory. This is a jurist, and they don't say these things lightly. To hand down rulings in opposition to this is gross deviation. It is dalala. It is gross deviation and tyranny. It's oppression. So let's stop there, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And how much time do we have?
I don't know. Half an hour.
Halb Stunde? Okay, sehr gut. So
We have enough time.
I wish I could speak to you in German. Inshallah, give me some more time. Give me some more time. But my German is not strong enough. Yes?
When we begin the questions, could you just repeat the questions?
Yes, okay, good idea. So let's begin with questions. Why don't you pick the question? You pick the question.
Conform with my religion, there's other things not going conform with my religion. These things I would not accept. For me.
Yes.
But for the Germans that not believing in this religion, they can do what they want. So as you said, I don't drink wine, red wine or white wine is okay.
most of what I've said is probably completely new to many of you. It shouldn't be. You should have been taught this from the time that you were little. But for most of us, we've never heard this before. And because it's new, and because it also is changing the way we think, our cognitive frames, then all kinds of questions come up about all sorts of things. And that's why these things have to be studied, and you have to ask questions, and we have to work things out. Again, as we said all through the lecture, good cultural norms, not bad cultural norms. And this means that we accept what is in harmony with what we believe and with our principles. And it doesn't mean that we start eating pork and that we start drinking wine. Other people can do that, yes. That's their business. But I don't want to do that as a Muslim. That's not allowed to me as a Muslim. And therefore, that won't be part of my culture. It doesn't mean that they do this here, so we do it too. No, that doesn't mean that. This is not a blanket acceptance of other cultures. But it means that we meet people by adopting what is good that they have. And our brother brought up the question of tashabbuh, which means imitating other people. That's a very good point. And here our fuqaha, they draw the distinction between mushabaha and tashabbuh. Mushabaha is looking like another person. That's not a haram. Tashabbuh is when you want to look like the other person because you have an identity crisis. That's not good. We do not want to jar the culture around us because we look totally different. You want to, and all of you, most of you are always dressed like that anyway. You have a type of dress that is recognizable in this country. And the more that we do that, the better it is. And again, this doesn't mean you have to take off your scarf or anything like that. That's not what we're talking about. You can make your scarf as beautiful as you want to make it. You can make it different ways. But again, when it comes to dress, the Prophet ﷺ indicated that God does not like the people who do tashabbuh. But tashabbuh is not looking like that person. It is that you have to look like that person because you are ashamed of yourself. You do not have dignity in yourself, and that's not good. So these are very different things. And this means, again, that in aspects of dress, we meet people halfway or even more. And it is good for us to be recognizable. In traditional societies, every primary group had its own identity expressed in many things, including dress. That's not true of the modern society. Modern society, technological society, is a mass society. And therefore, we have no dress. And dress does not indicate religious affiliation. And that doesn't mean that it's wrong for us to indicate that. But again, we have to do it in a way which is culturally intelligent. And I hope that we will be all the time more and more successful at that. Yeah? Okay, so this question is about the mosques. And we showed how the traditional Islamic mosque is a mosque that will imitate the sacred architecture of the area that it goes to. It will respect that. It doesn't copy it, by the way. It doesn't copy it, but it takes those themes and then it reworks them. And it makes them its own way, but that way which is beautiful in our eyes also is beautiful in the eyes of the people around them. And with all respect for Turks, who have a strong cultural tradition and a natural inclination to protect it, and for all, with all due respect to people who want to build mosques that look like the countries that they came from, this is not necessarily the best way to go forward. And, we have to move here. And in moving here, you want to live and to learn and to create an environment that does not jar with their identity and their culture. And we usually are horrible about that today. And we tend to be not necessarily culturally predatory. There are among us groups that are culturally predatory. We don't care about the cultures. This is what happened to African American Muslims in many of our communities in the United States. They were taught this by their teachers, who told them that you have to wear the white thobe, the women have to wear the black, they have to cover their face. Okay, so what happens to you and your culture? What happens to you when you visit your grandmother? You didn't have to do this. The sunnah is not, and they would call this sunnah. You know, this wasn't even the way the Prophet dressed, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And now this is going to be the sunnah, and you have to follow it. The sunnah is not a substitute for culture. The sunnah is there to create culture. But, you know, when we live in these societies have deep cultural roots. It's true their cultures are in flux. They're changing because our values are changing. But you want to respect their culture. You want to make them comfortable with you in their culture. And that doesn't mean you give up your identity, and it doesn't mean you disappear, you know, into the society and you have no identity or religion at all. But it means be creative, be culturally creative. When the Soviet Union fell apart in the 1990s, as you know, there are many Muslims in the former Soviet Union. This is something we used to study, and I had a great friend, Dr. Alexander Bennigsen, who was an authority on the Muslims of the Soviet Union. We used to lecture about that. But when the Soviet Union fell, then the Muslim peoples there, they generally want to come back to Islam. This is what we find overwhelmingly the case. And I remember a great merchant from a particular Muslim country who went to one of those republics, and the women there said, "We want to dress like Muslim women." And so he said, "Well, then you'd probably want to do this and that." But he said, let's go to the market, you buy me the cloth that you like, and you make your dresses. You design your dresses, and make dresses that are beautiful in your eyes and in the eyes of the people around you. So this is very important. And of course, a lot of the problems that we're facing in Europe, you know, they do reflect racism in some cases, they reflect nationalism in some cases, you know, but, I mean, should you be building an Ottoman mosque in Switzerland? Does Islamic law endorse you to do that? I'm sorry, it does not. You can build your Ottoman mosque in Turkey. It fits in there perfectly. But in Switzerland, there's no need for this. And in fact, I would say this is not called for. The Swiss are not that happy with us being there anyway. And the Swiss are very proud of their culture and their architecture. So you should respect that. This would be my advice. And I hope I don't offend anyone by saying that. This is a very good question. It's a very, very good question. And what our sister is asking about is that in Germany you have so many different ethnic groups. A lot of them don't even speak another language. They might speak Albanian or Bosnian or Turkish or some other language. Maybe they've been here for a while and they still don't speak German. And so how can we create one German Muslim culture out of that? And this is a very good question. And here I have a book which is called The Life of a Muslim in Victorian America, The Life of Alexander Russell Webb, Oxford University Press. One of the things that I talk about, because this Alexander Russell Webb, he became a Muslim in 1888, and he died in 1916. He loved the Turks, by the way, and he was honored by the Ottoman Sultan, Abdul Hamid. But one of the things, Webb is an amazing person, and his life was right in the center of American history as it develops from 1846, when he was born, until 1916. The Civil War, the Movement West, Jesse James, the slavery, the Indian Wars, the Mexican War. So when I discovered Webb, it's like we can tell his story and tell about America, about the history of the blacks, the history of the Native Americans, the history of the whites, the Hispanics. These were the main elements there. But in doing that, one of the things I talk about in the book, and I don't talk about it very long, but you can see it if you read it, is how did culture develop in the United States? Okay? And this is not radically different from what you're asking. The colonies, whether they're the American colonies or whether they're the Spanish colonies or South Africa or Australia or wherever they might be, all of them face this problem. For example, one of the biggest problems in early American history were the Germans. Did you know that? Because almost all the Germans who came to America were very religious people. They were very religious people. And they didn't care anything about politics. And they just wanted to keep their language and farm their farms and worship in their church, like the Amish, like the Mennonites and others. They were a huge part of the population in that early period. But you have these other groups. You have different kinds of Englishmen. You have Scots-Irish. You have French Huguenots. You have Germans. You have other kinds of groups. How do you make this into a culture? Because if you do not create a culture, you will not survive. This is also very important. You want to survive in Germany, you've got to have a culture that fits here. You've got to give a culture that enables you to negotiate this society. Don't think that you're going to live here like an immigrant forever, because that doesn't work that way. So in America, this was the problem you had. And therefore, you have three cultural zones. You have New England, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. That's New England. It leads New England. You have a special cultural ethos developed here over more than 100 years. Very difficult to do. They develop their own way of speaking. They develop their own houses, their own values. Then you have the Mid-Atlantic, which is New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. And the Mid-Atlantic is going to be primarily Dutch, because the Dutch settled that area. It takes over Dutch Protestant ethics. It's very different. It develops a different type of culture. And then you have the South, which will be developed in Maryland and Virginia, very different. But this was necessary to do so that they have an identity as a culture. They cannot remain different groups and succeed and be. So this is what some anthropologists call first effective settlement. First effective settlement. And the important thing here is what they call effective. And of course, they're using the word settlement because they're talking about colonies. And the colonies are settling. They're coming and living there. You've settled here. But you have to have an effective settlement. And that effective settlement makes it possible for you to stay. It makes it possible for you, to do what you have to do here. And that means that these elements have to come together. With the blacks in America, you have something similar. Africans are brought as slaves. They don't have any choice in that. They didn't want to come. Their tribes are destroyed. Their languages are destroyed. But they too have to become a new people. Otherwise, they will not survive slavery. And in the history of blacks in the United States, this is what will happen. It happens with them later, around the 1830s. But it happens around the 1830s because now slavery has been prohibited. The importation of slaves from Africa. So there are no new slaves coming. And therefore, all the Africans that are there, they are able now to begin to create their own culture. They do this sort of naturally. but they also have to survive. So it means they have to have their English, they have to have their values, they have to have their way of living, and they need to have an identity that comes to them from their culture. So I would say that this problem that you're talking about, this is always what happens when you bring different kind of ethnic groups together who have something shared like a religion, and who in our case want to remain Muslims. We want to be Muslims, and good Muslims. But I think that in doing this, you have to have scholars. And again, scholars are men and women. We have to develop women scholars in some families. If the woman says she wants to study Islam, they will have nothing to do with it. What you want her to be a maid, or she has to just be a housewife forever? And it is fard kifaya. It is a societal obligation for women to become fully authorized Islamic scholars in everything. Quran and Hadith and fiqh and language and just as it is for men. And historically, we always had the woman scholar also. So when we get scholars from among ourselves, then we begin to solve these things. And here also, artists are very important. People who speak for us and speak to us. Stories are important, many other things. But for many Muslims, they would say that to be culturally compatible is forbidden. You must be culturally incompatible. You'll never survive. You'll never survive. Your children don't have a chance. And again, if I'm in the United States today, so what kind of a culture do I want to create? And here we have to be very clear that culture is not meant to be monolithic. We don't want everyone necessarily to have exactly the same thing in the same way. And I have Swiss ancestry. I have German ancestry. Do you think that I'm ashamed of that? No. Do you think I'll give it up? No, I won't. So I want that to be part of my culture. And Hispanics, Native Americans, all of this is part of our culture. And a person who's come to us from South Asia, they shouldn't be ashamed of the fact that they come from this great civilization, or from Turkey, or from the Arab world. So we can take many things. And also part of our culture is that we are rooted in Mecca and Medina and Jerusalem, right? The Holy Lands. So we don't give that up either. Don't we go to pilgrimage? Don't we go to Umrah? And it doesn't mean that we can't wear. I wear a turban in Chicago. I wear a tailasan, a shawl in Chicago. I wear it at particular occasions. And this is allowed in that culture because you are a religious scholar. So the Jew will dress his way, the rabbi will dress his way, the priest will dress his way, and they don't mind. Muslims have also their religious figures, and they don't say, no, you have to wear a suit and tie. If I go to the University of Chicago, I wear a suit and tie. If I go to some other things, I'll wear a turban and a shawl. Or maybe I'll wear some other kind of dress. So, this is not rigid. But at the same time, it has to be compatible. We have to learn the right places to put things. And may we be successful at that. Ameen.